Please welcome San Francisco Foundation trustee, Ophelia Basgal.
In the work that I do every day, I'm the regional administrator for HUD. I talk a lot about this issue of equity, and I was thinking when I was coming here today that this week on Monday I was at a groundbreaking for a transit-oriented development in Hayward. Everybody talked about equity. On Wednesday I was with the Black elected officials, faith-based leaders, people from the community in Oakland, and there was a lot of talk about equity. And what Fred talked about a bit being somewhat, it's a daunting task, and there's a little bit of despair in what I hear when I'm going to some of these meetings. But what I say to people is, if you're not doing anything on Friday, come to Bay Area Bold, because this is where people who are leaders in this field, who are innovative, who are collaborative, are going to help us figure this out. And so I'm so pleased to be here and have an opportunity to hear from the panelists that we're going to hear from today, to work with Fred under the kind of leadership that I think you've just seen demonstrated this morning. So my task this morning is to have an opportunity to introduce the plenary panel, who really are some of the best representatives of the bold, innovative, collaborative leadership in the Bay Area that has been sort of laser focused on this issue of initiatives and philanthropy aimed at addressing inequity in our community and promoting economic opportunity and a quality of life for everyone who lives here. So they're going to discuss bold investments in the future, cross-sector giving to expanding opportunity. And they are, our first person is the co-founder and co-CEO of Beneficial State Bank and Tomcat Ranch Educational Foundation, philanthropist and Bay Area Bold co-chair, Kat Taylor. Second is the head of the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency, a member of the board of directors of the Trans-Bay Joint Powers Authority, and president of the National Association of the City Transportation Officials, and a committed BART rider, Ed Reiskin. Not BART, excuse me, Muni. Ed thought he got elected to something else. Next, nonprofit strategist, youth development leader, freelance photographer, and Bay Area giving lead at Google Org, and I found out a neighbor of mine, Justin Steele. And CEO of the Workers Lab, an innovation lab that invests in entrepreneurs, community organizers, and technologists to create replicable and revenue-generating solutions that improve conditions for low-wage workers, Carmen Rojas. Thank you, and enjoy the panel.
So Kat, Ed, Justin, Carmen, welcome. Thank you for participating with us this morning. I was going to say some framing remarks, but I think people have probably heard enough from me this morning. But I did want to kind of highlight the importance of and the reason why we wanted to pull together this group. One of the things that we are really thinking about is kind of how we engage different sectors and corners of the community in some of the solutions to the issues that I just raised. And we're convinced that a lot of this has to do with the cultivation and support and reliance on private sector leadership, public sector leadership, corporate leadership, and others. But it also relies on the ability of these different sectors to work together. And so we wanted to bring together a group of people that were both doing work deeply within their sectors, but also thinking about how across sectors we need to work in order to address some of these issues. We asked them not to make any presentations to you this morning so that we could keep this at a conversational level. But the first thing that I wanted to ask the group is, what are some of the promising approaches and strategies that you all are working on right now within your sector that you think really kind of get to speak to solutions around this issue of equity? And anybody can start.
I'll go. Thanks so much for having me. We sit at this really interesting intersection that's often tough between social justice and social enterprise. And oftentimes these two things are irreconcilable. Some of the most promising things that I see with our lab partners are those where organizations are sort of taking the leap of faith and building revenue generating and for-profit infrastructure to help support their nonprofit work. And so an example that you might hear about later from Saru Jayaraman from ROC is we've invested in them to build a mobile app that will help train low-wage restaurant workers to move into fine dining jobs where the difference in wages is from being a tipped worker at $2.30 an hour to making up to $70,000 a year with benefits. And so I think that there's a real hunger and appetite for organizations to build this kind of infrastructure. I also think that there's this, not directly related to our work, but just out in the world and in this country, there are a number of organizations that are building new, longer sustaining revenue streams, like the Movement for Black Lives, that has used its foundation support to build small donor infrastructure so that everyday people who believe that Black Lives Matter can actually invest in this movement. And so I think that there's a lot of really interesting ways that that these on-ramps are being created for opportunity, that we can all see ourselves in that.
I guess we'll just keep it moving down the line. From a Google perspective, I think the theme of this conference is very relevant, this Bay Area Bold, because I think the reality is not enough nonprofit and social sector leaders are given permission and funding to really be bold in their approaches and ideas. I was just reading an article yesterday from the head of Google X Labs, which is the kind of research arm of the company that makes the driverless cars and the Google glasses and some of those really innovative things. And one of the things he said in the article was there are 1,000 ideas, literally 1,000 ideas that they evaluate before they land on one successful project that you end up actually hearing about out in the public. And so a lot of times when I'm out talking to nonprofit leaders, and just a year ago I was one of those nonprofit leaders leading a workforce training program in Washington, D.C., struggling to figure out, how do I innovate? How do I keep pushing the envelope? How do we scale this program? How do we reach more people? And how do I get the resources to do it? And so what we're really trying to do, Google invests almost $40 million a year here in the Bay Area to nonprofits, and we're really trying to get that capital to some of those bold, visionary leaders who we're honestly trying to give permission to take those risks. So people like Jeff Kaczynski, who I saw earlier today, I know is out there in the audience, leading Hamilton Family Center, really saying we could, if we had the political will and resources and innovation, literally end family homelessness in San Francisco. Like, that's not that far off from reality. It just is a matter of how do we find the right innovation and get the right resources behind it. Or Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's coming up later today, we supported her with a large grant last year, really trying to think systemically about how do we eliminate sort of childhood stress and trauma and the effects of that we know have this long tail of lifelong outcomes. But some of those approaches require not just $10,000 investments or $20,000 investments, but $1 million at a time to really be able to think boldly and be given the flexibility to test maybe not 1,000 ideas, but more than one idea and really be bold in their approach. And so I think there's a lot of promise, and I see this shift in philanthropy slowly happening, and hopefully the tech community can be a part of that, but really trying to get behind some of these bold visionary leaders that we have in abundance here in the Bay Area and giving them permission to take those risks and think boldly about some of these challenges.
So Fred made reference to the cost of living in the Bay Area and how the acuteness of it is what's driving inequities, or in part what's driving inequities in our region. And when we think of the cost of living, there's a lot of attention on housing, and rightly so, because that's a big part of people's household budget. One other big part is transportation, and the housing and transportation pieces somewhat go together. The more you're pushed out, as Fred was saying, he was hearing out in Pittsburgh and Antioch, often the more time and money you're spending on your transportation budget. So housing may go down, but transportation goes up. I had a really interesting conversation with a city economist earlier this year, and I apologize for juxtaposing the words interesting and economist in one sentence. But what the conversation was about was kind of the nuances of the connection between transportation and the health of our economy. And while I think everybody understands that transportation does help drive the economy relies on people being able to move around the city and the region. One thing that he explained to me is that there's forces that are driving economic growth that basically will happen almost independent of what we do with regard to transportation. There's a lot of people that want to be here. There's the freeways that are lacking, the on-ramps that are creating opportunity for some, that are driving our economy. How we choose to invest in and provide for transportation is what can make a difference in terms of the diversity of our economy. the diversity of folks who can live here. So my board of directors, with support, strong support from Mayor Lee and the Board of Supervisors, have really been focused on making transportation as affordable as possible, and in some cases even free. And so kind of the bold move that we took was our free Muni program, where first we made Muni, which is the city's transit system, made it free for low and moderate income youth up to age 18, and for youth as long as they're in high school and certain other categories of youth. And then followed that by making Muni free for low and moderate income seniors and people with disabilities. This complements a half-price transit program that we already have for folks who don't fit in those categories, but that are low income. And I'll mention, in terms of private sector partnership enabling public sector to be bold, 2 years of our free Muni for Youth program was funded by Google. But so this focus on affordability is really how we're trying to get, at least at the transportation side of the housing plus transportation equation, to try to offset some of the impacts that are driving inequity in our city.
Thanks, Ed.
Okay, so I just contributed to the old part by misusing my technology. Sorry. Anyway, it's a privilege to be part of this working session. And I think to back up a step from the bank, which is still a four-letter word in a lot of people's minds, my husband, Tom Steyer, and I really feel like to help the second age of enlightenment be the first age of true equity, we had to address three of the dominant drivers of society right now, which surely includes the banking system, the food system, and the energy system. And to take the banking system, it really requires a change for the good wholesale across the entire system. And the only way we could think to do that was to design a new kind of bank that was aligned by its ownership in the public interest, that was fully committed to the new economy, meaning fully inclusive, racially and gender just, environmentally sound, and not through our back door reinstalling the old economy, and as transparent as possible, broadcasting everything we do, not just what our loans support, but how we show up as a modern American corporation. As a bank, I think we are inherently cross-sectoral. We are heavily regulated. We enjoy the privilege of FDIC insurance, which binds us to a number of commitments to the American people who support the FDIC insurance. So we have an ironclad relationship with government. We believe in the social sector. We support the social sector, but we also have an opportunity to present a new menu to philanthropic capital. Some of the newer sections of that philanthropic capital may not believe that the social sector can ever overwhelm the oppressive influence of the economy through some of these longstanding financial incumbents. And those would be replete in the energy, banking, and food systems. So just to take one example of really listening to, I listen hard to Fred's listening tour, because then inherently I get to listen to the voices out there who are identifying not just what's going awry, but what we need to do to open up the opportunity set. I'll just take one example. We pay attention to collective decisioning wherever it happens. And a lot of it is happening by definition outside the recognized electoral mechanisms. We have very poor participation in voting. It's understandable because we are in a reverse network effect. We hope that voting would be more valuable to everybody who votes because the most of us are showing up, but we're not. So one example of collective decisioning is that 62% of millennials have no credit cards. They don't want a credit card. They've learned by experience that credit cards lead to debt traps, overfeeing, and even things like overconsumption and too much materialism. And we applaud that. How could we not? That is just awesome. But one thing they value at the same time that they eschew debt is the ability to access it on fair terms if and when they need it. That for the millennials is a problem conceptually in the future, but it will show up when they want to. They won't want to buy a car, likely, because they're so smart to avoid cars, too. But when they want to buy a micro apartment somewhere or send an offspring to higher education, something like that. So that same phenomenon leads us to smart problem solving on behalf of those who have been not just excluded from the financial system, but actively oppressed by it. That the access to credit is almost a human right, and it has to be on fair and transparent terms. So we work very hard on an alternative to payday lending. There is no Nancy Reagan solution. You can't say, just don't do it. Everybody needs emergency credit from time to time, and we need to be there to provide it as the next gen bank that we need to become.
So, Kat, I want to stay with you for a second. The things that you're describing in terms of what you all are trying to accomplish as a bank sound unique to someone like me who's not in the banking industry. Do you feel like you and your objectives and the things that you're trying to accomplish makes you an oasis in the desert, or are you finding that your other banking colleagues are coming along with you on this kind of stuff?
So we are actually an error term in the banking landscape. I will be very proud to report on behalf of my colleagues at Beneficial State Bank that we've grown to $550 million in assets. That sounds like a giant number to me. But when you recognize that Bank of America is $2 trillion in assets, we literally are a car change that they could lose on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, since they had a $4 billion accounting error ride their balance sheet in their capital account for a year, and that actually isn't meaningful, we are very tiny in the banking landscape. Mm-hmm. However, I'm reading Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath, and the thesis is that we've misunderstood these lopsided battles to assume that David only beats Goliath by some miracle or magic, that it wasn't foretold by the actual assets and restrictions of the two proponents. Military strategists in the day would have told you that David was destined to win. Goliath was a large, immobile, overburdened by defensive weaponry, non-strategic participant in that fight, and David slay him by remaining remote, agile, and having a deadly shot with a rock to the forehead. So we're a teeny tiny David, but we have to deploy a lot of strategies to shift the banking system because nothing else will do. We need the banking system to start respecting the crowdfunders who support it. That would be all of you depositors. It's your vision that they need to be deploying. And I think we need to awaken the deposit base. That's the first and foremost strategy we have, to migrate deposit, equity, and human capital to a better bank model that respects our common desire to, let's say this, not hurtle into climate disaster or exacerbate the worst income and wealth disparity we've ever seen. That would be nice for starters. We have to take other tactical moves too, which is simply activating depositors where they sit in their banks to rattle their cage bars and say, I won't settle for anything less. We have to broadcast what fair and transparent fees are with lots of benchmarking. We have to embrace technology and innovation that's disintermediating banking. My prediction is in 5 years, we will be half technology company, half bank. Mm-hmm. And we have to present the most marketed, competitive products for everyone. We all do better when we all do better. So we are especially focused on un- and underserved markets and bank products that can really change the future. Not just fair and transparent access to credit, but for instance, accelerated savings programs, especially for small dollar savers. That will be the hallmark, I propose, of our participation in Oakland's Promise program, getting kindergartners to and through college. But we begin, and we have all the skill set that we need on our side, like a tiny little David.
Thank you. Carmen, yeah. Carmen, one of the things, or two of the things that are really, really interesting about the Workers Lab is the focus in on the kind of creation and growth of good jobs, but also the fact that it's kind of sparked by and led by organized labor. Can you talk a little bit about how organized labor is kind of viewing where we are now and some of the roles that they think they can play in this?
Sure. So just for some context, we were founded by the Service Employee International Union in large part because there was this sense that labor was under attack, that the nature of work and the on-ramps that were created by the labor movement in the 20th century actually were being decimated by a political climate and economic climate that the labor movement could not respond to at that quick of a pace. And so SEIU co-founded the Workers Lab in large part to act as this accelerator. We invite for-profits and nonprofits to come in and test out ideas that have the promise of building power for working people in the 21st century. I think one of the, it's like my relationship to the labor movement is so interesting in large part because I'm an inside outsider, right? Like I don't come from the labor movement, but my dad was a Teamster. I recognize that, you know, I personally benefited from the labor movement and reject the fact that, that what the data is telling us now, that, you know, the vast majority of people in the generation behind mine will not be able to experience economic opportunity like I was, as in large part due to the decline of the labor movement. And so I think that what you see is this really interesting investment into things like the Workers Lab, into the Fight for 15 across the country. You see partnerships with organizations like the National Domestic Workers Alliance, and really trying to take the key pillars that made the labor movement strong in the 20th century, an independent revenue stream, the ability to scale across geographies and industries, and a focus on building power for people who work, and trying to seed those three things in ventures across the country. So I see ourselves really as part of an ecosystem that's being created by the labor movement in large part to ensure that working people have a voice in the future of our economy and on the future of our democracy.
Thanks. And I know that you have the kind of unique perspective, and because you both kind of run SFMTA, but you also get a chance nationally through your work to kind of get a sense of what other transportation organizations are doing. And I'm wondering, kind of, are your colleagues kind of thinking about this in the same way that you are? I mean, it's obvious that you're thinking about transportation investment and transit issues in terms of how it can provide opportunity and level the playing field. Are you guys alone in that, or what are other folks thinking? How are other agencies thinking about this?
I think to some extent, the industry as a whole is thinking about that. And I think, you know, generally public transit has always been something that is an amenity to communities that address equity issues. Pretty much all public transportation agencies in the country are recipients of federal funds, and as such are subject to the requirements of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which require us to make sure that our services are serving disadvantaged communities, requires us to evaluate and report on our own hiring and promoting and discipline and firing. So there's both from kind of the federal perspective, but also just inherent in what public transportation is. And I mean, think about it in San Francisco. It's a system, it's one of the few places in society now where people from all walks of life come together, all levels of the economic spectrum, all different people of all different sizes, shapes, colors. So I think there's inherent equity in public transportation. That said, you know, when we started the Free Muni program, and we're up to, I think, more than 80,000 people who are participating in that program. That's more than 1 in 10, or about 1 in 10 San Franciscans, which is pretty phenomenal. Some of the reaction I got from some of my colleagues across the country is, what are you doing? You guys are giving away transit, so we're all starved for resources, as we are. What are you doing? And you know, it was not easy for us to be able to make that decision because we have significant needs, lack of investment of a generation. But you know, we're San Francisco, and we felt that it was the right and necessary thing to do. I think that there's probably not too many others who are doing it. I don't think there's anybody else who's doing it at the scale we're doing it. In a different kind of smaller example, I also currently serve as the president of the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and one of the programs that we've started is looking at bike share. And I don't know how many folks are know about bike share, but we have it here in the region. It's going to grow in the region. One of the things that cities that have done bike share have found, it's been a very narrow demographic. It's been basically young, white, more wealthy men who participate. So we've initiated in a program and a lot of good lessons from cities around the country about how not just we in the region, but programs across the country can reach a much more diverse group of folks who can benefit from bike share. There's issues of banking, of technology, of culture, but we're looking at Boston has done great things, Philadelphia's done good things. So there's leadership in different ways to make the transportation more equitable across the country.
And Justin, just want to ask you one thing. I mean, it seems like every time I leave a meeting or run into somebody, they just met with you, and that you're supporting a lot of kind of great efforts going on in the Bay Area. I'm about to start calling you the Sammy Davis Jr. of corporate philanthropy. Tell me kind of how you are kind of thinking about this in relationship to other corporate sector philanthropy, folks who are engaged in philanthropy. Are they kind of keeping pace with the kinds of things that you're doing?
I think particularly the tech sector is struggling with what philanthropy looks like in a consistent way that like fits the values of this innovative tech movement. I think you've seen a lot of generosity from the founders of tech companies like Mark Benioff and Mark Zuckerberg, even Larry and Sergey, who are a little bit quieter in their philanthropy, but a lot of generosity from founders. But I think the companies themselves are really struggling with what does it look like to do philanthropy in an innovative, moonshot thinking, 10x thinking kind of way. And even if you track the evolution of Google.org's life cycle, it started with the thesis that our engineers with some resources could go out and solve the world's problems. And I think over time, it's been humbling to sort of learn that a lot of these social challenges that are deeply entrenched don't yield very easily to computer scientists simply trying to solve and hack the problems. And so I think this newest iteration of Google.org is really exciting to me because I think in some ways, it's a little bit more traditional. I think part of the reason I'm running into all the folks you're running into is I'm following in your guys' footsteps. Like, we need to learn more from the San Francisco Foundation and other funders who may be seen from the tech sector as a little bit more traditional philanthropy, but there's a way to sort of mirror the innovation with the traditional. And so my approach has really been to look at, low-income and underserved communities are really struggling. What are the biggest leverage points? So we've done deep investments in homelessness, youth employment, and most recently racial justice. And next week, actually tomorrow, we'll open the public voting for our Impact Challenge, which is a $5 million contest open to any nonprofits in the Bay Area. And we've got 10 really, really incredible ideas for you guys to vote on. And you guys will determine of that $5 million how it gets portioned out to those top 10. So really hope that you guys will be on the lookout tomorrow for that announcement and vote your hearts for those top 10 organizations.
Thank you. I'm getting the flag that we're running out of time, so I don't think everybody will be able to respond to this last question. But for any of you, do you see any kind of promising things or things that are exciting you that are cross-sector in nature, that really kind of is bringing together nonprofits and public sector leadership and private sector folks to kind of work together on some of these issues around equity?
I'll just throw quickly one out, which is the Pay for Success movement, this kind of social impact bond. California had its very first project in Santa Clara County, where Santa Clara County itself put up $10 to $11 million in success fee payments for abode services to serve the chronically homeless. And it's a little bit of a complicated thing, but the way it works generally is if abode services stably houses those chronically homeless individuals, the Santa Clara County will actually pay back investors who have put up the initial capital. So Google put in $500,000 to that project. Abode Services is going to be able to serve 200 chronically homeless individuals. And if they are successful in stably housing them, Santa Clara is going to give us $500,000 back, and we're going to give that right back to Abode Services. So we're just going to recycle it back into the community. But I think that's a really innovative way to kind of bring government and innovation and nonprofits together with private sector funders like Google. So that's one.
And we have a the pay for success model that we're experimenting with at the bank level. Banks are very powerful because they enjoy leverage. We collect at a minimum 9 deposit dollars for every $1 of equity that we deploy through the lending process. It's recycling too, so it has a cumulative effect. And it's very, very disciplined because we have to satisfy our regulators and be safe and sound. So we thought, well, what we're really changing the world by is our lending. So how can we accelerate lending that achieves co-benefits and use financial incentives to get that done? So we're experimenting. We've done one ourselves, but if we can get it right ourselves, we can also recruit philanthropic capital to this, but basically paying for positive outcomes. So you enter a contract with a borrower for 100 units of workforce housing in a housing desert, 100 new living wage jobs fully benefited in a persistently high unemployment community, et cetera, that kind of thing. Third-party auditable, at the end of the borrowing term, if they've achieved those results, they get paid back the equivalent of 2% or so on their loan. That lowers their cost of debt. That's a very dominant form of competition in the marketplace for them. It preferences their outcomes to their competitors. It also puts us in a more competitive role because we can outcompete conventional banks that aren't monetizing those benefits in that way. And it flips the metrics dynamic because now that becomes a core part of their business to produce those third-party auditable metrics. We think we can do this in scale, and that this might be a product, if you will, that entices that philanthropic capital out of the wings, especially the technology-driven fortunes.
Carmen, you look like you want to say something. We got 1 minute.
I think that there's really interesting work happening in Oakland with Fund Good Jobs, which is a fund that does something similar to what's being described up here, raises capital from not the program side of a philanthropic organization, but from the investment side of a philanthropic organization, and uses it to incent employers to create jobs that are living wage jobs, offer benefits, and I feel like there's a really interesting role to be played there, so I feel like that's an important one to add to the mix.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panelists for some really kind of great solutions-oriented ideas.